The Vethrani Accord was supposed to be neutral ground, a place where species from across the galaxy could trade and rest without fear of violence. But everyone who lived there knew the truth. And the truth was simple. Power made the rules. And the Cathari had all the power. Now Lieutenant Varric of the Silent Third Colonization Fleet had made a terrible mistake that day. And his mistake was nothing more than walking down the wrong corridor at the wrong time. His pale blue exoskeleton catching the light of the cargo bay as three massive figures stepped out of the shadows to block his path. The Cathari stood 7 feet tall, each one covered in dark green scales that seemed to absorb the dim lighting of Cargo Bay 17, and their eyes glowed with a soft bioluminescence that pulsed red when they were angry, which was most of the time these days since their empire had won the war and they had learned to enjoy their victory in the cruelest ways possible. "Look what we found," the largest one said. His name was Torek, and he was a lieutenant in the occupation force that had been stationed on Vethrani to keep the peace. Though his definition of peace involved a lot of broken bones and terrified civilians, Varric tried to step back. But the other two, Cathari, had already moved behind him, cutting off his escape. And he felt his hearts begin to race as he understood what was about to happen. "I want no trouble," Varric said, his voice coming out steadier than he felt. "I am simply passing through to reach my transport." Torek laughed, and it was a wet clicking sound that made Varric's antenna flatten against his skull in instinctive fear. "Your transport," Torek repeated, mocking him. "Your empire has no transports anymore, Bug. Your fleets are scattered across the void. Your homeworld is ash. And your people are refugees begging for scraps at stations like this one." The words hurt because they were true. And Varric had spent many sleepless cycles trying to accept this new reality, trying to understand how his entire civilization had fallen so quickly. But understanding did not make it easier to bear. Torek grabbed him by the front of his worn uniform and lifted him off the ground with one massive arm. And Varric felt his feet dangling in the air as the Cathari brought their faces close together. "Do you know what I did during the war?" Torek whispered, his breath hot and foul against Varric's face. "I burned 3 of your colony worlds. I watched your people run screaming from their homes, and I laughed." Then Torek threw him, and Varric's back slammed against the steel bulkhead with a sound that echoed through the cargo bay. And he felt something crack in his exoskeleton, a sharp pain shooting up his spine as he slid down to the floor. He tried to stand, but one of the other Cathari kicked him in the side, and he went down again, curling up to protect his vital organs as the blows began to rain down around them. The cargo bay was not empty. There were dock workers loading crates, merchants checking their inventory, refugees waiting for transport to wherever they could find shelter. But none of them moved to help. None of them even looked in his direction, because everyone knew what happened to people who interfered with the Cathari. And everyone had learned that survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. Torek grabbed Varric again and slammed him against the bulkhead. And this time, the crack was louder, and pale ichor began to seep from the fractures in his armor, running down his back in thin streams that left wet trails on the metal floor. "Your empire burns," Torek hissed, slamming him again. "Your fleets scatter," another slam. "And here you are, alone, with no one to save you." Varric's vision was starting to blur, and he could feel his consciousness slipping away. And part of him welcomed it because at least unconsciousness meant an end to the pain. But another part of him raged against the unfairness of it all, against dying in a cargo bay at the hands of thugs who would face no consequences for their cruelty. The Cathari raised him for another slam, and Varric closed his eyes and waited for the impact, but the impact never came. Instead, there was a sound of footsteps, small and unhurried, crossing the cargo bay floor, and then a voice, young and female and completely calm. "Let him go." Varric opened his eyes and saw something impossible. a human girl had walked into the cargo bay, and she had her hand wrapped around Torek's wrist, stopping his arm mid-swing with a grip that should not have been possible for a creature so small. She was young, perhaps 19 standard cycles, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and skin that had the warm ochre tint that came from being born on Earth itself. Not one of the colony worlds, but the actual human homeworld, with its crushing gravity and thick atmosphere and endless dangers. She wore a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit, the kind worn by workers in the orbital shipyards, and her name was stitched above her heart in faded letters, Maya Chun. The cargo bay went absolutely silent. Torek stared at his own arm, at the small human hand wrapped around his wrist, and his bioluminescent patches began to pulse a deep crimson that signaled danger and rage. "You dare touch me," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You dare put your hands on a Cathari officer." Earthborn. Maya did not flinch, did not step back, did not show any sign of fear at all, and her brown eyes met Torek's glowing gaze without wavering. "I said let him go." The other two Cathari began to circle around, moving to flank her, and the onlookers started backing toward the exits because everyone knew what was about to happen. Everyone knew that the human girl had just signed her own death warrant, and no one wanted to watch what came next. Torek smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth that had been designed by evolution for tearing flesh. "Little human," he said, "do you have any idea what you have just done?" Maya Chem looked at him, looked at the two Cathari moving to surround her, looked at the broken silent soldier still dangling from Torek's other hand. And then she did something that would be talked about for years to come. She smiled back. "Yeah," she said, "I do." For 3 long seconds, nothing moved in Cargo Bay 17. And the silence was so complete that Varric could hear the distant hum of the station's life support systems and the soft drip of his own ichor hitting the metal floor. Torek was still staring at his wrist, at the small human fingers wrapped around it, and his mind was struggling to process what was happening, because this was not how the universe worked. This was not how things were supposed to go. Humans were soft. Everyone in the galaxy knew this. They were a novelty species from a backwater world in an unremarkable solar system. They had only achieved faster than light travel 3 generations ago, and they had spent most of their short time in the galactic community keeping to themselves and staying out of the wars that had reshaped civilization. The Cathari had never bothered to study them closely because why would they? Humans were weak and fragile and utterly beneath notice. Just another minor species that would eventually be absorbed into one empire or another when it suited the larger powers to do so. And yet, this human girl, this tiny creature in her grease-stained jumpsuit, was holding Torek's arm in place with a grip that he could not break. "Release me," Torek growled, and he pulled against her hold, putting the full strength of his massive body into the motion. But Maya's arm did not move, did not even tremble, and her feet stayed planted on the deck as if she were rooted to the metal itself. "Release the soldier first," Maya said, and her voice was still calm, still quiet, still completely without fear. The other two Cathari had completed their circle now, moving to positions on either side of her, and their bioluminescent patches were pulsing in patterns that signaled aggression and bloodlust. "You are going to die here, Earthborn," Torek said. "You are going to die screaming, and we are going to make sure it takes a very long time." Maya glanced at the 2 flanking Cathari, then looked back at Torek, and something shifted in her expression. Something that made Varric's antenna twitch with a sensation he did not recognize at first, because it had been so long since he had felt it. It was hope. "You talk too much," Maya said. And then she moved. What happened next would be replayed in Varric's memory for the rest of his life, would be analyzed and discussed and debated across the galaxy for years to come. and would change the way every species thought about the small soft creatures from the planet called Earth. Maya released Tarek's wrist and dropped low, so low that her body seemed to fold in on itself. And Tarek's reflexive grab passed through empty air where her head had been a heartbeat before. She came up inside his guard, her palm driving into his solar plexus with a sound like a cannon firing. And the impact lifted Tarek off his feet and sent him flying backward across the cargo bay, his massive body crashing into a stack of cargo containers 15 feet away. He did not get up. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This was not the quiet of anticipation or fear. This was the absolute stillness of a universe that had just witnessed something impossible and was trying desperately to make sense of it. The Cathari on Maya's left recovered first, roaring as he lunged at her with claws extended, his scales rippling with the force of his charge. Maya sidestepped at the last possible moment, a movement so economical that she seemed to barely shift at all, and her hand caught the back of his head as he passed, redirecting his momentum and adding to it, sending him face first into a cargo container with enough force to dent the metal. He slumped to the ground and did not move. The third Cathari hesitated, and that hesitation would haunt him for the rest of his days, because in that single moment of doubt, Maya had already closed the distance between them, her feet gliding across the deck in a pattern that looked almost like dancing. She swept his legs out from under him with a kick that moved too fast to follow, and as he fell, she drove her elbow into his chest with a strike that echoed through the cargo bay like a thunderclap. 3 Cathari warriors, each one 7 feet of muscle and scale, and barely contained violence. And they were all on the ground in less than 4 seconds. Maya Chun stood in the center of the cargo bay, surrounded by the fallen bodies of her enemies. And she was not even breathing hard. The onlookers who had been backing toward the exits had frozen in place, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. And some of them would later describe a feeling like waking up from a dream, like suddenly seeing the world clearly for the first time. Varric slid down the bulkhead, his cracked exoskeleton screaming with pain. But he barely noticed because all he could do was stare at the impossible creature before him. Maya turned and walked toward him, stepping over the unconscious body of one of the Cathari without looking down. And she knelt beside him with an expression that was somehow both fierce and gentle at the same time. "Can you walk?" she asked, and her voice was soft now, concerned, as if she had not just defeated 3 of the most feared warriors in the galaxy with her bare hands. "I think so," Varric managed to say, though he was not entirely sure it was true. "Good," Maya said. "We need to move. They will send more when these 3 do not report in. And I would rather not be here when that happens." She helped him to his feet, her hands surprisingly gentle for someone who had just demonstrated the capacity for such devastating violence. And she let him lean on her as they moved toward the maintenance corridors at the back of the cargo bay. "Wait," one of the onlookers called out, a Vethrani merchant with purple skin and too many eyes. "Who are you? How did you do that?" "What are you?" Maya paused at the entrance to the maintenance corridor, half supporting Varric's weight, and she looked back at the merchant with an expression that was almost amused. "I am nobody special," she said. "I am just a mechanic from the Shanghai orbital yards." And then she was gone, disappearing into the maze of corridors that ran through the station's infrastructure, leaving behind 3 unconscious Cathari and a cargo bay full of witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they had seen. The Vethrani merchant stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, and then he looked at the fallen Cathari and then at the other witnesses who were slowly emerging from their shock. "Did that just happen?" someone asked. "I think so," someone else replied. "What do we do now?" The merchant thought about it for a moment, thought about the occupation and the fear, and the way everyone had learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. And then he made a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything he could imagine. "We tell everyone," he said. "We tell everyone what we saw here today." The maintenance corridors of Vethrani Station were dark and narrow, designed for service drones rather than living beings. But Maya moved through them with the confidence of someone who had spent years working in similar spaces. Varric struggled to keep up, his cracked exoskeleton sending waves of pain through his body with every step. But Maya adjusted her pace to match his without complaint, guiding him through the maze of pipes and conduits with a patience that seemed at odds with the urgency of their situation. "There is a medical station in Section 7, she said, her voice low to avoid echoing through the metal corridors. "I know the doctor there. She will not ask questions, and she will not report us to station security." Varric nodded, too focused on putting one foot in front of the other to speak. But his mind was racing with questions that demanded answers. What he had witnessed in that cargo bay should not have been possible. The Ketheri were among the most physically powerful species in the known galaxy. Their scales were dense enough to deflect blade weapons. Their muscles were capable of crushing metal with their bare hands, and their reflexes had been honed by millions of years of evolution as apex predators. And yet this small human female had defeated 3 of them in seconds. How? Varric finally managed to say, the word coming out as more of a wheeze than a question. Maya glanced back at him, her brown eyes catching the dim emergency lighting of the corridor. "How what? How did you do that? How did you defeat 3 Kethari warriors? I have seen them tear through armored soldiers like they were made of paper. I have seen them shrug off plasma burns that would kill any other species. They are monsters. They are unstoppable, and you stopped them with your bare hands." Maya was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice had a thoughtful quality that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Your people have been in space for a long time." "Yes, thousands of generations traveling between the stars, building empires, making war." "Yes," Varric said, not understanding where she was going with this. "And in all that time, you have encountered many species, thousands of different peoples, from thousands of different worlds." "Yes, and you have learned to judge them quickly, to categorize them based on their homeworlds and their biology, the strong ones from the high-gravity planets, the fast ones from the worlds with predators, the smart ones from the places where survival required cunning rather than strength." Varric nodded. This was simply how things worked. Every species in the galaxy understood the basic principles of evolutionary adaptation, and those principles allowed you to predict what any given species would be capable of. "When your people first encountered humans," Maya continued, "what did you think of us?" Varric considered the question, reaching back in his memory to the first reports he had read about the strange bipedal creatures from the Sol system. "We thought you were unremarkable," he admitted. "Your world seemed harsh by galactic standards, higher gravity than most inhabited planets, dangerous levels of oxygen in the atmosphere, extreme temperature variations. But the species that emerged from such conditions were typically small and cautious, adapted for survival rather than dominance. And humans fit that pattern. Yes, you had no natural weapons, no claws or fangs or venom, no armored skin or enhanced senses. You were soft and fragile and seemed poorly suited for a hostile galaxy. We assumed you would remain a minor species, never expanding far beyond your home system, never becoming a significant factor in galactic affairs." Maya smiled at that, and there was something in her expression that made Varric's antenna flatten with unease. "Do you know what a death world is?" she asked. Varric blinked. The term was familiar, but rarely used in serious scientific discourse. A world so hostile that the evolution of intelligent life should be statistically impossible, he said. A hypothetical category, most xenobiologists consider it more myth than reality. Earth is a death world. Maya said simply. They had reached a junction in the maintenance corridors, and Maya paused to check both directions before guiding Varric to the left. toward a ladder that led upward into the station's residential sections. "I do not understand," Varric said. "You looked at Earth and saw a harsh world that produced cautious survivors. But you missed the context, you missed the history, you missed what it actually took to survive there." Maya helped him onto the ladder, positioning herself below him in case he lost his grip. And she continued speaking as they climbed. "For 200,000 years, humans struggled against everything our world threw at us. We were not the fastest creatures on Earth. There were predators that could run us down in open ground. We were not the strongest. There were animals that could tear us apart with a single blow. We had no armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning." They reached the top of the ladder, and Maya pushed open a hatch that led into a narrow service corridor in the residential section. "So how did you survive?" Varric asked, genuinely curious now despite the pain and the danger. "We learned," Maya said. "We watched the predators that hunted us, and we learned their patterns. We studied the animals we wanted to eat, and we learned their weaknesses. We developed tools because our hands could grip and manipulate objects in ways that other creatures could not. We developed language because our brains could process complex information and share it with others." She guided him down the corridor, past closed doors and humming machinery. "We hunted mammoths with sharpened sticks. Do you understand what that means?" A mammoth was a creature the size of a small shuttle, covered in thick fur and armed with tusks that could impale a man. And humans hunted them with pointed pieces of wood, because we learned how to work together and how to exploit weaknesses. "That is impressive," Varric admitted. "But it does not explain what you did in that cargo bay." Maya laughed, and the sound was surprisingly warm. "It explains everything. We did not survive by being the strongest or the fastest. We survived by being adaptable, by refusing to accept defeat, by getting back up every time we were knocked down and trying something new." They reached a door marked with medical symbols, and Maya knocked in a specific pattern. 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones. "And we developed something else," she said as they waited. "We developed martial arts, systems of combat designed to allow a smaller, weaker fighter to defeat a larger, stronger opponent. My grandmother taught me Wing Chun from the time I was 4 years old. I've been training for 15 years to use my body as a weapon." The door opened, revealing a Vethrani female with medical markings on her purple skin. And she took one look at Varric's condition before stepping aside to let them enter. "Humans are not weak," Maya said as she helped Varric onto a medical bed. "We have never been weak. We have simply been underestimated, and that is not the same thing at all." The medical bay was small but well-equipped, and the Vethrani doctor, whose name was Selic, worked quickly and efficiently to seal the cracks in Varric's exoskeleton with a specialized bonding compound that hardened into a substance nearly as strong as his natural armor. Maya sat in the corner of the room, her legs crossed and her eyes have closed, and Varric realized with some surprise that she was meditating, her breathing slow and steady despite everything that had happened in the past hour. "She does this often," Selic said quietly, noticing Varric's gaze. "Comes to my clinic after her shifts at the shipyard. Sits in that corner and breathes. She says it helps her stay centered. You know her well. She has been coming here for 2 years now. Ever since she arrived at the station, she fixes the equipment I cannot afford to replace, and I provide medical care when she needs it. Though she rarely does." Selic applied another layer of bonding compound to a particularly deep crack near Varric's shoulder. "I have never seen her fight before," the doctor continued. "She always seemed so gentle, so patient. I knew she practiced some kind of physical discipline, but I assumed it was for exercise, for health. I did not realize she was capable of violence like that." Varric looked at Maya, really looked at her for the first time since the cargo bay, and he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had witnessed. She was small even by human standards, probably no more than 5.5 feet tall, with a slender build that suggested speed rather than strength. Her hands were calloused from manual labor, but they were not the hands of a warrior. They were the hands of someone who worked with tools and machinery. And yet those hands had caught a Cathari mid-swing, and had driven that same Cathari 15 feet through the air with a single strike. Why? Did you help me? Varric asked. And Maya opened her eyes at the question. I already told you. You said you helped because I needed help, and you could provide it. But that is not an answer. That is an evasion. I am silent. My people have no alliance with Earth. We have never traded with your colonies or fought alongside your fleets. You had no obligation to intervene and every reason to stay out of it. Maya uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Do you know what my grandmother used to tell me when I was young? Varric shook his head. She said that the measure of a person is not what they do when others are watching. It is what they do when no one is watching, when there is no reward for doing right and no punishment for doing wrong. When the only thing that matters is what you can live with. She stood and walked over to the medical bed, and Varric saw something in her eyes that he had not noticed before. A depth of emotion that was carefully controlled but unmistakably present. I have seen what the Cathari do to the species they conquer. I have heard the stories from refugees who pass through this station. Families torn apart, cultures destroyed, entire peoples reduced to slavery and despair. And every time I hear those stories, I ask myself what I would do if I were in that situation. If I had the power to help and chose not to use it. Most people choose to survive, Varric said. And there was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. Most people do not have a choice, Maya replied. They are not strong enough or skilled enough or positioned well enough to make a difference. But I am. I have spent my entire life preparing to be capable. And what is the point of capability if you do not use it when it matters? Selic finished applying the bonding compound and stepped back to examine her work. You are lucky to be alive, she told Varric. Another few impacts and your exoskeleton would have collapsed entirely. Your internal organs would have been crushed. I know, Varric said. And he looked at Maya with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and bewilderment. You saved my life. And I do not even know why you were in that cargo bay. I was taking a shortcut to the shipyard, Maya said with a slight shrug. I had finished my sleep cycle early and wanted to get a head start on the day's repairs. I was not looking for trouble, but you found it. Trouble has a way of finding people whether they look for it or not. The only question is what you do when it arrives. Varric sat up slowly, testing the repairs to his exoskeleton, and he felt a strange sensation building in his chest. Something he had not felt since before the war. Since before his homeworld burned and his people became refugees scattered across the galaxy. I have served 40 cycles in the Silent Fleet, he said. I have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. I have seen species that once ruled vast territories reduced to footnotes in history. And in all that time I have learned one truth that seemed absolute. What truth? That power is everything. That the strong rule and the weak serve. That compassion is a luxury that extinction does not allow. I accepted this truth because I saw it proven again and again. And when my own people fell, I accepted that we had simply been weaker than our enemies. Varric stood, his repaired exoskeleton supporting his weight without complaint. And he faced Maya with something approaching wonder in his compound eyes. But you have shown me something different. You are not strong by galactic standards. Humans do not have the raw physical power of the Cathari, or the technological superiority of the old empires. And yet you defeated 3 of their warriors with nothing but your own body and your own will. It was not will alone, Maya said. It was training and technique and knowledge accumulated over thousands of years by my ancestors. But why did they accumulate it? Why did humans develop these arts of combat when you had no natural weapons and no empire to defend? Maya smiled. And it was the same smile she had given Torek in the cargo bay. The smile that said she knew something the rest of the galaxy did not. Because we have always believed that it matters how you treat the people around you. Even the ones who cannot help you. Even the ones who are different from you. Even the ones who are weak. She put a hand on Varric's shoulder. A gesture of connection that transcended species. We call it being human, she said. And it is the most powerful weapon we have ever developed. The story spread like fire through dry grass, jumping from ship to ship and station to station through the vast network of trade routes and refugee paths that connected the galaxy. Within a single cycle, it had reached every corner of Vethrani Station, whispered in taverns and marketplaces by people who had witnessed it firsthand and people who had heard it from those who had. And with each telling it grew larger and more detailed. Though the core remained the same, a human girl had stopped 3 Kethari warriors with her bare hands, had stepped into a situation that everyone else had been too afraid to interfere with, and had done it not for profit or politics, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Within a week, the story had spread to the neighboring systems, carried by merchants and travelers and refugees who could not stop talking about what they had heard. And it began to change in the telling, becoming less a simple account of violence and more a symbol of something larger. Did you hear about the human on Vethrani? They said she was just a mechanic, nobody special. But she stood up to the Kethari when nobody else would. She showed them that not everyone is afraid. She showed them that there are still people willing to fight back within a month. The story had reached the refugee camps where the survivors of conquered worlds huddled together in misery and despair. And it began to take on an almost religious significance. A tale of hope in a galaxy that had forgotten what hope felt like. They say humans are different. The refugees whispered to each other in the darkness of their cramped shelters. They say humans come from a death world. A place so dangerous that only the strongest and most stubborn could survive. They say humans never give up, never surrender. Never stop fighting even when all seems lost. The Kethari High Command heard the rumors, of course. Their intelligence networks were extensive, and their informants were everywhere. But they dismissed the story as propaganda, as the desperate fantasy of conquered peoples, looking for something to believe in humans were weak. Everyone knew this. They were a minor species with no significant military capability. They had chosen neutrality in the Great Wars, precisely because they knew they could not compete with the real powers of the galaxy. And the idea that a single human female could defeat 3 Kethari warriors was simply laughable. But Lieutenant Varric knew the truth. And he had begun to speak. He had returned to the refugee camps where his people waited for transport to whatever temporary haven would accept them. And he had started telling his story to anyone who would listen, describing in precise detail what he had witnessed in Cargo Bay 17, explaining what Maya had told him about Earth and human evolution and the arts of combat that had been developed over 200,000 years of struggle. They are not what we thought, he said to gatherings that grew larger with each telling. They are not weak or fragile or insignificant. They are survivors in the truest sense of the word. They have been fighting since before their species could walk upright. And they have developed capabilities that we cannot begin to understand. But they are neutral. Someone would always say, they stay out of the wars. They do not take sides. What good is their strength if they will not use it? One of them used it for me, Varric would reply. One of them chose to step into a fight that was not hers, to risk her life for a stranger of another species. And she did it because she believed it was the right thing to do. He would pause then, letting the weight of his words sink in. What do you think would happen if more of them made that choice? What do you think would happen if they decided that watching the galaxy burn was no longer acceptable? The question hung in the air, unanswered but not unanswerable, and in the minds of his listeners something began to stir. something that had been dormant for so long that many had forgotten it existed hope. Meanwhile, on Vethrani Station, Maya Shen returned to her life as if nothing had happened. She went to the shipyard and repaired broken engines and damaged hull plating. She visited Selik's clinic to meditate in the quiet of the medical bay. She ate her meals alone in the small quarters she rented near the docks when people recognized her. When they pointed and whispered and sometimes approached to thank her or ask questions, she was polite but dismissive, insisting that she had done nothing special, that anyone would have done the same in her position, but no one else did. A young silent refugee said to her one day, one of Varric's people who had sought her out specifically to express his gratitude. Everyone else looked away. Everyone else was afraid. Only you stepped forward. Maya shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. On Earth we have a saying, she said. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. I did not want to be someone who did nothing. What does that mean? To be someone who does nothing? Maya thought about the question. About her grandmother and the lessons she had learned as a child. About the history of her species and all the times they had faced impossible odds and refused to give up. It means that every person has a choice, she said finally. Every moment of every day, you can choose to look away from suffering or you can choose to face it. You can choose to protect only yourself or you can choose to protect others. And those choices define who you are more than anything else. The young silent looked at her with something like reverence in his compound eyes. Will you teach us? He asked. Will you teach us to fight like you do? Maya was silent for a long moment. And when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, as if she was considering something she had not considered before. I can teach you what I know, she said. But fighting is not the most important lesson. The most important lesson is deciding what is worth fighting for. And so she began to teach. First one student, then a handful, then dozens. Refugees from a dozen different species who had lost everything and were looking for something to believe in, something to hold on to in the darkness. She taught them how to move and how to strike, how to use their bodies as weapons and their minds as shields. But more than that, she taught them the philosophy behind the movements. The belief that strength existed to protect the weak and that courage meant standing up, even when you were afraid word of the classes spread. Just as the story of the cargo bay had spread, and it reached the ears of the Keth Ari occupation force, who began to realize that something was changing on Vethrani Station, that the conquered peoples they had dismissed as broken and defeated were starting to look at them differently, with less fear and more defiance, with less despair and more hope, and far away on Earth, in the halls of government where decisions were made that affected the fate of species. Reports began to arrive about a mechanic from the Shanghai orbital yards who had accidentally become a symbol of resistance, and discussions began about what it might mean for humanity's policy of neutrality if their people kept getting involved in other people's wars. Maya Chun knew none of this. She was too busy teaching and working and living her life one day at a time. But she sometimes looked up at the stars, through the station's observation windows, and wondered what would happen next. She did not know that she had started something that could not be stopped, that her single act of compassion had planted seeds that would grow into something vast and transformative, that across the galaxy people were beginning to ask themselves a question that had not been asked in a very long time. What would happen if someone stood up to the Kethari? What would happen if the conquered peoples stopped accepting their fate? What would happen if enough people decided that doing nothing was no longer acceptable? What would happen if they all started being human? The answer was coming, carried on the whispers of refugees and the dreams of the defeated, spreading from star to star like light itself, and the galaxy would never be the same.